Well, welcome everybody. My name's Kerry Moss. My colleague Willow Hewitt, and my other colleague Lola, who's helping us with the Q&A today. And we're here to talk all about the 11 plus, how to avoid that last minute panic, and some key topics to be aware of, including grammar schools, particular things to be aware of for students who speak English as an additional language, and also a bit about independent schools as well. We'll have a time section at the end of today for questions. We can answer things as much as possible. So throughout the meeting, if you think of a question for us, please send it in the chat to Q&A questions. And we're going to create a list and we'll get through as many as we can at the end. So give me a moment just to share my presentation. Willow, is that visible now? Perfect. So we're going to start off with, briefly, who we are. So as I said, I'm Kerry Moss. I'm a program manager and partnerships lead for Seven Springs Education. Seven Springs Education is sort of a sister company to a larger organization based in Hong Kong that you might have heard of called iLearner. Both myself and Willow, who's our director of operations, have worked here in the UK and in Hong Kong, and we know both sort of education systems pretty well. So, clearly everybody here is hoping to avoid a last minute panic for the 11 plus and any other entrance exams that you're interested in, because you've joined us here today. But why is it important? As you think about embarking on your child's 11 plus journey, it's crucial that we think about a long-term strategy for their success. And whilst last minute cramming may seem appealing, it can lead to increased stress and anxiety, which can negatively impact performance. So instead, we recommend a well-structured and gradual approach to be more effective. So it's a marathon and not a sprint. The 11 plus exam is designed to assess a child's potential. So not just what they currently know, but their potential for success in the future. So it tests critical thinking, problem solving, and subject-specific skills. And by starting early, you can help your child to develop these skills gradually and build their confidence. So the exams test students on at least what they have learned to year 5, including everything they've learned in year 5. And most exam syllabuses go beyond this as well. So it's not just what they've learned at school, but their ability to apply those strategies and think critically to work out ways to answer unfamiliar questions, especially for new subjects like verbal reasoning and non-verbal reasoning, which are like nothing your child really will have encountered before, which can be quite daunting. So many children benefit from building their skills in these subjects over a longer period of time, which helps them to learn decoding skills, to become good at managing their time in a demanding exam scenario. So how to prepare? There's lots of different ways that you can prepare, and you know your child best. Your child's school teacher will be able to advise you as well. But here are some suggestions. So one suggestion is long-term academic support tuition. And by that, I sort of mean a year or maybe more of sort of weekly or regular sessions. And this might be in specific 11 plus subjects, or it could be more general support, because this develops the knowledge. It teaches them things, as well as skills, critical thinking, problem solving that I've mentioned, but also it builds a habit of self-study and of learning, which will help them when they get to the sort of final run up to the exam day, but also beyond. And once they're at that school, they'll have that habit of regular study, which is really important. After all, you know, you're putting all this time and effort and energy into getting them into an academically selected school, a grammar school, or a selective and independent school. And the reason being is because the demands of those schools are significant. It is hard work. So it's important that they learn those skills at an earlier stage. But it's not all about cramming heads full of stuff. It's also about making sure that those heads are equipped to deal with all of that information. So building confidence and resilience. And we all want the best for, we want the best for our students. You all want the best for your children. Teachers want the best for their students. And we all just want them to do what they can, to try their hardest. But the fact remains that this exam, the 11 plus, is likely to be one of the most significant academic tests they've had in their life so far. For most children, it is the first type of exam they've had like this. And so as much as we try to downplay the pressure, the stakes are still quite high, and children are intelligent, they understand that. So we want to think of ways to ease that pressure. So our biggest recommendation, which I keep saying, is starting early, because you normalize it. It becomes part of the routine. It becomes like a gradual increase rather than a sudden big emphasis on studying. Another recommendation is enrolling your child in tuition. And that's so they can build these skills in a peer group, so they can share in the successes and the challenges. They can talk to each other about, yes, I found that really difficult too. And being able to see somebody else finding something difficult is often quite reassuring. And then the success and the joy that you feel when you overcome that together makes it a positive learning experience rather than a stressful one. And finally, sort of that parental encouragement and reassurance that you want the best for them, but also you just want them to do their best. And you'll all have your own ways of communicating that to your children. And this long-term support helps children to excel in exams and builds their resilience. But this resilience is invaluable, not just for navigating the pressures of the 11 plus, but also for future academic challenges. Resilience is like a muscle, and it's something more and more in UK schools that teachers are trying to build in students to help them to cope with pressures as they get older. So the more you can do to give them that at a younger age, the more confident and skillful they will be at tackling challenges in their future. So, what is the problem of last minute preparation? Like, what's wrong with it? In my opinion, and in my experience, last minute cramming can tend to lead to some of these issues. So exhaustion, if you're trying to fit too much in too short a space of time, which then can lead to a lack of self-belief. If the child doesn't have enough time to find something difficult, but overcome it and realize that they can do it and build confidence, they're stuck still at the first stage of not being able to do something. They don't believe that they can overcome challenges, which then can be a huge barrier. Knowledge gaps. So often the more advanced content on the exam that they've not learned at school, they've not got to it yet. And so they don't know how to answer questions. Then also stress and nerves, last minute pressure raises the stakes of the exam, can also potentially lead to conflict at home. So if you're suddenly changing a schedule, no, you can't go to football this week because you have to do 11 plus practice, causes disagreements, and the whole thing becomes a lot more stressful. So that's why we recognize the limitations of last minute preparation. It can help with exam familiarity and drilling skills that you already have, but it can't compensate for building that foundation early in a strong way. So, ways to prepare. We've created recently a really great resource, which is on our website, which includes some of these tips, but I'll just briefly go through a few of them. So for year 3 students, you've still got a long way to go until exam day. I would encourage some independent reading, but also reading together. We often think that children get too old for reading together with parents or grandparents or older siblings, but that's not true. Everyone, everyone likes it, even adults enjoy it. But it helps them to build their vocabulary, inference and analysis skills. It's a festive season coming up, so you could use some festive crafts like string decorations, so creating patterns on a string with orange slices and cinnamon sticks, and or doing paper chains as well with color patterns, and recognizing those is really good for nonverbal reasoning. Into year 4, we're looking at things like making sure your child has a really established reading routine, even if that's 10-15 minutes before bed. And generally we say reading anything is better than reading nothing. So even if it's a book that you think, oh, it's too easy for them, or it's a bit of a silly book, that's better than them not doing anything at all. And a lot of the hurdle with reluctant readers is getting them to read something they enjoy. So if it's not Dickens, that's fine. If it were Dickens and a child in year 4, I'd be surprised. So it's all good. Something is good. In terms of something fun, Christmas crackers. So drawing out the nets for the shapes, writing riddles, writing jokes. These all use, it seems like a fun, silly activity, but actually it's building really important skills that apply to the 11 plus. And then into year 5, closer to exam day, writing a longer form text, so maybe a seasonal newsletter. You could add in some calculations, like, for example, this year I had this many school lunches, this many birthday parties, and spending time calculating that. And then integrating games and puzzles into your holidays. There are some suggestions there. So, some resources, bond practice tests. Other publishers are available, but practice tests are a great way to start. Your current primary school's website might have some resources for you, and your aspirational school's websites will definitely have something to guide you. There's a great website, the 11 Plus Guide, and there's loads more information on our website, more resources, and a familiarization test as well. So I'm going to stop and pass over to Willow, who's going to take over.
Hello, so thank you for joining us today. We're going to move on to a slightly different topic, so I'm just going to share a different presentation for you. We're moving on to what looks like a really small, specific topic, but it's actually one that applies to everybody in some way. So as Kerry mentioned, both she and I have worked in Hong Kong for a long time, which is a place where students all have fantastic levels of English. They're very hardworking. I have never had a student who wasn't like absolutely passionate about learning in some way. So they're great candidates for 11 plus exams, but they're not first language English speakers. And we have many students like that in the UK. And also everybody who's a first language speaker, they have some areas where they're stronger than others. So there'll be some parts of their skills for the 11 plus exams that aren't as strong as we might want them to. So everything I'm going to say here will apply to all students in some way, but it's really applying to those who speak English as an additional language across the board, so in all ways. So I'm going to do the presentation and I'm going to bring Miss Kerry back up for a couple of sessions to talk through some model questions with us. So to give us a good idea of the sort of student that I'm thinking about today, and to give us an idea of what problems they might have, I'm going to talk about a case study. It's a real student that I've had who, her name isn't Haley, but it's more memorable to call her Haley from Hong Kong. She had been taking classes with me for a couple of years, and we in fact did a critical thinking course. She sometimes did some writing classes as well on the holidays. She went to one of the top schools, top local schools in Hong Kong. So a fantastic student, very, very bright. In fact, both her parents had also studied overseas. They had a very high level of English at home, and they were very supportive and engaged. Both her parents would come in to talk to me. Her brother also came to lessons with me. The family was really, really um, excited about things. And when they moved to the UK, they were excited to start a new education over here as well. And they wanted they wanted Haley to apply to these grammar schools. But she just wasn't ready for it, even though she was fantastic, really, really great in her school. She needed some extra work. So I'm going to talk through the areas of her studies that she needed extra work in. And the main one was vocabulary. Even though in her school day to day she spoke English and she spoke English in her classes with me, uh, there's still a lot of vocabulary that she really wasn't familiar with. And even thinking back to myself when I was her age, there was vocabulary in the 11 plus exam, which I took and which Kerry took as well. That was really advanced and was not things that I was encountering every day. It's not vocabulary that's covered in schools. It's meant to be very advanced vocabulary, and it's often what makes it even harder for second language speakers. It's very British. It will focus on local sports, local animals, and if you don't know that a badger lives in a set, maybe you'll get that question wrong. So we want to make sure that students have got a long time to prepare for this, because the other complication is there's no preset vocabulary. You cannot just do it like for the Cambridge exams, the PET and the CET exams. There's no vocab list. You just have to have an incredibly high level of vocabulary. So as Kerry said, long-term preparation really is the key for this. And to show you what we're really talking about, I'm going to give you a couple of example questions that I think often surprises parents just how hard the questions are. Also, remember, this is for students who are at the very beginning of year 6. So they might be 10 years old, they might be young for their age, and they will find these questions really hard. So we can see an example here that's an analogy question that actually looks pretty simple. Exercise is to gym as dining is to something. And exercise and gym both go together so closely. We do exercise in a gym. Where do we dine? In a restaurant. There's really only one eating related word, so it seems obvious. But nib is to pen. It's not that common to know the word nib at 10 years old, or when you're starting to prepare, you might even be 9 years old. So you might not know it's the very end of a pen. As fingertip is to what? And the answers don't give you any help because they're all connected to the body. So it could be anything, but we need to think about, you need to know the word nib to know where it belongs on a pen, to think what is fingertip on the end of my arm. We've also got up here in the top right an example of another one which has just complicated vocabulary, and then it's almost like it's designed to trick second language speakers who are slightly less easily able to discern between different parts of speech and where they might belong. So they weighted with baited something. As a first language speaker, you'd actually find that relatively easy because it's a set phrase, baited breath. But if you're looking at it as a word that you might have learned, you might struggle to figure out what goes here. And then I'm going to bring Kerry up to talk us through this sort of question in the bottom right, which is a grouping question, which really is designed almost to trick you. So, Kerry, how does this sort of exercise work?
Yes, these are tricky questions and they can be formatted in different ways, but this is one way in which they can be formatted. So you have a group of 5 words, 3 go together and 2 don't go with the group in the same way. And there are lots of different ways that the words could be grouped. So if we look at number 1, colon, apostrophe, heart, kidney, sentence. Well, straight away, I'll be thinking, right, heart and kidney. I recognize that those 2 are organs in the body and they go together.
Oh,
and then I might go,
colon, apostrophe, and sentence go together. They're grammar words.
Yeah, they're all grammar words. But then that's the question. Is it colon, apostrophe, and sentence together and heart and kidney the odd ones out? Or is there a different combination? And the tricky thing here is firstly to recognize that colon has 2 meanings. So it is an organ in the body, but also is a piece of punctuation. So if you were able to recognize that it's also an organ in the body, then maybe you'd be able to group colon, heart, and kidney. But then also it's recognizing that even if it is colon, the punctuation mark, apostrophe is also a punctuation mark, but sentence doesn't neatly fit with those. It's not a punctuation mark. It doesn't fit in the same way. So that's part of the struggle there.
There are a
If we
couple of
look at,
meter ones here. So number two is a
yeah,
meter one, but it requires strong vocabulary. So you have to know the words polo, rounders, and squash, which are all quite specific games that I can't imagine many 9 and 10 year olds play. If you know all those, that's an easy one. But if you don't know them, you're guessing. What's an example of a really hard one here?
a really hard one. I'd say four is very tricky because of vocabulary. So
Mm-hmm.
there's some very niche vocabulary here. If you know it, it's easy, but if you don't know it, I think this would be just you'd have to guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's multiple words here you might
Um,
not know. I think tress is very uncommon. And then you might think, do some of these have two meanings? Because some of them I can't understand. How could armor, whatever this word is, lock and key, do they go together? Do they belong with armor because they're some sort of fighting words? Then you're starting to make real guesses. And students need to have practice with this sort of question to know that real guesses are not how you answer these sorts of questions. You have to have quite a high level of confidence. So in fact, tress is quite an old-fashioned word now, but it's an old-fashioned word for hair. So you would in fact know you can have a lock of hair, the tresses of your hair, and you can have curls of hair. So they go together, but you have to feel confident about all the words in there. Number six is difficult in another way. Can you tell us about number six here?
yeah, so six is difficult because at first glance, you might think that all five can go in a group together. Oh, they're all something to do with fire or burning. But then that's where you're stuck because you want a group of three, not a group of five. Um, so there's lots of different combinations that you might talk yourself into. So, okay, well, maybe it's wood and then you have the flame and then it turns into charcoal. So it's like a process. But really, that would be a different type of question. Or maybe you'd think, okay, well, it's to do with having vowels, but four of them have vowels in, and that would be a very random way to group them. So it's being able to recognize what's the difference. So a barbecue is an object that you would burn things in. Charcoal is something that you would burn to create heat. Wood is something you would burn to create heat. Flame is the heat and the fire that is produced. And kindling, something again that you burn to create heat. So the logic that you have to go through is extended.
And you have to know all the words there. You have to know charcoal and kindling, I think, less common at this age. So I think parents often really hope that they can just use a vocabulary cramming, or they think my child's got a great vocabulary. But there's two steps to most of these questions. There's having a high vocabulary, and high enough that you know multiple meanings of all the words, and being able to know it strongly enough to make those connections. So vocabulary really, this is the one area where I say if you haven't started a year in advance, you're really struggling. And it's not just an issue in this is the verbal reasoning paper. It's not just an issue in that if you're applying to independent schools, you're also doing an English paper, but also if you're doing things like the maths paper, that's got quite a bit of quite a few verb problems, which we'll see in a minute as well. But another type of question that we need to do a long-term preparation for is the analytical thinking. So when we're doing verbal reasoning, we just thought, and non-verbal reasoning, which are those ones which are lots of shapes mixed together, and you have to figure out what's the next one in a sequence or what's the analogy. Those require really unique thinking skills. And often just very specific technique. They look like you're either good at it or you're not. But you can practice and you can learn the limited number of types of questions there are on the exam and get better at even if you're not naturally good at it. And again, that takes time. And in fact, I would say it really helps to have somebody who is a good teacher of those. So tutoring or a helpful parent either is really good to go through that. It's not something a child can always improve by themselves. But look at some question types to see just how tricky they are. And as I said, this is the one you may be most familiar with where you're looking for the missing shape in a sequence. And this is a skill that's learnable. Often students are either very good at it or very poor at it at this stage. If you like this sort of thing, you'll think it's very easy. If you hate it, you'll think There's just a bunch of shapes. But you can learn techniques such as how does the shapes change, how do the colors change, how do the positions change, and you can find the right answer. People think of this one, but in fact, often the harder one, this is especially true for second language speakers, but it is true for everybody, are these ones that are in the verbal reasoning paper. So, Kerry, can you talk us through this one, which looks like just a jumble of letters and we've got some question marks? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, so the initial shock is none of this makes sense. I don't know what to do. So you children need to learn to approach it in a systematic way. And with these questions, you're looking for one letter that will go in both of the question mark spaces to complete all four words. So what I would recommend is starting with the word endings, which are often more recognizable than the word beginnings. And if you look at EIGN, for example, ain, you might know rain, like a mnemonic rains, or feign, perhaps. But okay, no, R and F don't work with the other word startings or endings, so it can't be that. Okay, let's look at EBT. Well, if you know that DEBT is debt, then that's a very quick answer because almost no other, I can't think of another word that ends in EBT. And then you retroactively fit it, FIND, find, MILD, mild, DEIGN is Dane. It's unlikely that a student at 10 years old would know Dane off the top of their head. But if they've got it to fit the other three, then the process of elimination says, right, it's correct. So it's working it out, but it's also then having the confidence to say, I'm not 100%, but I'm 75%. And that is enough for me to pick an answer and move on. So all sorts of exam skills that are going on.
Yeah, and also vocabulary skills that you have to know enough of the words to feel like I'm confident nothing else fits. Otherwise, you can waste a huge amount of time on this. And we also see if you're doing an English paper, some grammar schools, but most independent schools will have some sort of English paper. Uh, they'll have long text like this, and they'll have a poem or they'll have a piece of fiction, non-fiction. You can spend a long time reading it, and you can see in this, there's actually quite a lot of bad vocabulary in this poem and you might spend ages thinking about it. And the question requires you to really understand the poem. So the question is, in this poem, the poet aims to convey the something of the train ride. We need to put some sort of word in here. All of them fit, and all of them, if you skim through it, you could think they all fit. So is it the sound of the train ride? I can see some sound words here. I can see some beauty words. I can see it scary. The speed, they're talking about fast and by. And we have to use a few techniques that really just come from practice. So, Kerry, what are the top techniques for this sort of question?
So the first thing I would recommend with poetry is always to try and read it out loud. Obviously, you can't do that in an exam, but reading it out, performing it in your head, to pick up things like rhythm and rhyme and meter. And particularly with this poem, that's super important. And with this question in particular, as you say, it could be any of them. We're seeing witches, that's maybe scary. And we're seeing beautiful things like daisies and fields and things. But really, when we read each line, everything is coming back to speed. So it's the alliteration, faster than fairies, faster than witches. It's the rhythm, the rhyming, and also meaning of things like here is a mill, there is a river, each a glimpse and gone forever, meaning that things are passing quickly. So whilst it could be any of them, you're looking for the best fit. You're looking for the one that is, I have the most evidence to support it being this one.
Yeah, and this again, students can lose a lot of time on this. Whereas this is especially true for second language speakers. As a first language speaker, if you like poetry and you read it often, you would be able to skim through this and do it in a few seconds. But if you're really having to work hard to understand the words, or you don't like poetry and you just it looks unfamiliar to you, you could spend a long time on this, and then you're losing time for your exam. We've got one more big topic here, which is maths problems, which is often something that parents really underestimate when their child is a second language speaker. especially if you come from overseas. But it's also an area where you just might not be an area of strength for your child. So in the UK, maths problems really heavily rely on comprehension skills. They're often word problems, and they often require like local knowledge. Another thing to think about is that maths is taught quite differently in countries. So the questions might be worded differently. A child might easily have the math skills to answer a question, but it doesn't look familiar enough for them to think they know how to do it. So we're going to look at a couple of examples like that. There's an error in one of them that I just spotted earlier, but I haven't had time to correct. I pinched it from our draft folder. So we'll talk about that one in a minute. But this one up here, it's algebra, but then it's a word problem, which doesn't look like it makes sense. Kerry, can you talk us through that one? What problems might students have with it?
Yes, so algebra is actually part of the year six program of study for the national curriculum. So most students, by the time they are sitting the 11 plus for grammar schools or 11 plus level exams for independent schools, they're right at the beginning or at least sort of in the first sort of term of year six. So they might not have ever studied algebra before. And so the idea of a letter showing up in an equation is ridiculous. So that's the first big hurdle with this question. If they have studied algebra before, either because they have previously studied overseas and they cover algebra at a younger age, or because they've done some basic stuff in year five to prepare them, they might not have seen it phrased in a worded problem. This is actually quite a simple maths question, but I think there's a lot that would put even very capable students off. The wording and trying to work it out with the letters. I think that's the most off-putting thing about that one.
Yeah, and then we've got a couple here that are just very wordy for, again, what are incredibly simple questions. So when we were talking about this earlier, Kerry wanted to just make sure everyone's aware that students should be turning this into a numbers problem. Use a rough piece of paper to write down the numbers, do ordinary maths, take it out of the word problem, rather than keep having to read over and over and over again the text. It's just full of many different names, conversations about books, who's wrote their books. We don't care. They're just fraction problems. They're just fraction equivalents, and figure those out. And the same for these. They're just simple operations problems. So make sure they're doing that. And then the one down here, I would say, is one just wanted to highlight because it's just, again, it's trying to confuse you with language when it's actually quite a simple maths problem. So it's talking about a sheet pen. It's about enclosing a pen in fence panels. You might not know anything about that, and you might feel really put off by that. So we just spotted these should say meters on here to figure out how big the pen should be. Otherwise, it's a very small sheet going to fit here. Students might get so concerned about all the long question text, they might just skim through this and add up the numbers, forgetting that the spaces where the numbers haven't been added in, they need to calculate those from the sums over here and then do the math there. But again, writing sums down yourselves on a separate piece of paper to add or subtract, get rid of all the word problems. And we've got one other main problem students have. Really everyone, unless they're a big reader, really struggles with this, but especially for students for whom English is not their first language. The texts that they choose for 11 plus exams are not the texts that I would necessarily choose. They're often quite old fashioned, or they're very classic literary texts, which just have incredibly specific British backgrounds and language and things that happen, and it's quite off-putting if that's not what you're used to. So I've got some examples here just so you can see how tough they are. And this is an example of a question that's about a text which starts, and then the cul-de-sac was still until the rectory door slowly opened. And if you don't know what a cul-de-sac is or a rectory, you're already thinking, do I need to know those? Is that important to the question which asks why they're on separate lines? Is there something about cul-de-sacs that means you have to be on a separate line? Who knows? And so you get thrown by that. Also cultural references such as knowing what shows someone is wealthy in a specific culture, or this question has got a very old-fashioned feeling text and talked about a girl's doll. How does it tell us about the girl's life? You have to know a lot about the context of doll ownership and traditional toys in different countries. So students can just get very easily thrown by this. And the same with old text, which actually you get a really, really long text and a very simple set of questions for it, you could spend 10, 20 minutes working through this, trying to figure out what everything means. And you don't have to for the questions. But being more comfortable and familiar with text like this will help students just speed through a bit faster. And I've given some examples of the sorts of text that students at this age should have read. So they go kind of from younger to older. So we should be able to be starting in Charlotte's Web in year 3 or year 4, full of really complicated, old-fashioned vocabulary, but great to prepare you for this sort of test. And then we'll go into kind of older texts, ones that are kind of connected to colonial language, and then really classics that everyone's kind of expecting. So we've got a range of text for starters. Our newsletter that we'll get a link to at the end also has a lot of reading lists in very often to get students reading more. And just to give you a bit of update on Hayley, who struggled with mostly with vocabulary. She was so confident with English, she was fine at maths actually, and we'd done a lot of critical thinking classes. She was great at literature, but just didn't have the vocab. She used vocab builder books that we worked on, and she read extensively, and she had enough time to prepare. So she prepared for over a year with practice papers, lots of help from her parents, and she did get a grammar school place, and she is very happily studying there. So that is a fantastic success story, and it is very possible, even if you need to start early, it is doable. We know many other students who have made fantastic progress. So here are our contact details. If you ever want to ask us anything that you don't put in the Q&A yet today, do feel free to get in touch, but there is a Q&A you can ask us questions on today. We've got some space for questions. I'm going to transfer back to Kerry, who's going to talk specifically for a little bit about grammar schools, and then we're back to me for a bit more.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, toughest parts of grammar school applications and exams. So as a quick recap, a grammar school is an academically Great. Okay. So yeah, grammar school, an academically selective state school means non-fee paying. Confusingly, some schools with grammar in their name might not actually be grammar schools because they used to be a long time ago and then they turned into an independent school or they turned into a comprehensive school. It's confusing history of British schools, but always check. So just because something's called a grammar school, it might not actually be what we think of as a grammar school. There are over 160 grammar schools in England, and they're grouped in sort of hotspot areas and particular local authorities. So, for example, areas of Kent, different areas of London, Trafford near Manchester, Birmingham, Medway, parts of Buckinghamshire, Essex. So they're not everywhere. So, for example, if you look on the map, there aren't any in Norwich. There's hardly any in the east of England. Same with the northeast, not very many. But southwest, there are a lot. Southeast, sorry. So the first toughest bit of getting to grips with the grammar school exams is understanding the different exams and the different requirements. So some schools in their local area, so Trafford, for example, are grouped in something called a consortium, which means that all the schools join together in a group and they set the same exam. But it's not always that all of the schools in an area do this. Some might be in a consortium and some might not be. And that's to do with them wanting to set their own exams or other reasons. It's lots of politics, but it just means that for parents, you have to take the step to do the research for the schools that you want to apply for and find out what the process is. And whether your child only needs to sit one exam to cover 3 schools, or whether they need to sit 3 exams to cover 3 schools. There are different exam boards that set the different exams. Again, if you go onto the school's website, you'll be able to find information about which one they use. But it's complex and it's daunting. There's a lot of information. And so we always recommend speaking to your child's current school teacher if they have any advice. Consulting the school you're applying to, their website, and also consulting experts. So using a tuition company like ourselves, or any family friends you might know, anybody in your network who's been through a similar process who might have advice. Just be aware that things do change from year to year. So just because somebody's child got into the grammar school 5 years ago, it might not be exactly the same anymore. So things to be aware of. So for example, as I said, in Trafford, there are 5 grammar schools. All of those 5 grammar schools are in a consortium and they all use the same exam from GL assessment. So you just need to sit one exam and the results are considered by all of them, or all the ones you actually apply to. However, in Essex, there are 11 grammar schools. 10 of those schools are in a consortium together and use the same exam. However, one of them uses a completely different exam. So just things to research. Another thing that is tricky about grammar school exams is tricky topics and questions. Now, we've already covered a lot of this in the last section of the presentation. We mentioned algebra, which might be new. We mentioned non-verbal reasoning, and verbal reasoning is new subjects entirely for children to get to grips with, and the level of challenging vocabulary in verbal reasoning or English components. 11 plus exams are all different. At a minimum, they will cover the year 5 up to and including the year 5 national curriculum, but often will include some year 6 content too. And occasionally they throw in a rogue question that goes even beyond or outside of that. Which is why, as we mentioned, the long-term preparation and building skills is the best thing that they can do. Okay. Another tricky part is time management. So I've put up the times on the screen now are from GL assessment, which is the exam board used by 80% of grammar schools now. So it's not just about knowing how to do the questions, it's knowing how to do the questions quickly and accurately. So for maths, 50 questions in 50 minutes, but for reasoning, that's 80 questions in 60 minutes. It's more than one question a minute. So it's being able to recall facts and use skills rapidly, because it doesn't matter how strong your child is, if it takes them 2 minutes to answer one question, at the pace they have to work, they're only going to manage a maximum of half the paper, which means half the marks, which isn't going to be enough to pass, which is why that long-term preparation and building time management into it is so important. The next thing is the competition. Everyone's aware that grammar schools and independent schools as well are competitive, but here's some numbers for you to put it into context. So around 100,000 children sit the 11 plus each year for grammar school, and that number is going up. There is about a 30% pass rate, but just because you pass doesn't mean that you get a place. About 5% of students attend grammar schools. And to show you how that works, for an example of one area in England, this is an example of one area. 303 was the lowest score offered for a place. So 6 of the schools offered this as their in catchment lowest score offer. Okay. Then 333 to 342, 2 schools had this as their in catchment offer, and 2 of them you had to get this if you were outside of the catchment. I'll explain what catchment is in a second. 349, that's one of the schools out of catchment offer. But for one of these schools, the lowest score that they offered a place to anyone in or outside of catchment was 366. So you can see that this is all sitting the same exam paper. So remembered consortiums before. The same exam paper, but different schools have different sort of entry levels. Catchment areas meaning in catchment meaning 2 to maybe 4 miles from the door of the school, as close as you can be. Outside of catchment is anything further away, and there's normally a higher pass mark. Not always, but normally a higher pass mark. The final thing to consider with grammar schools and tricky things is that it's difficult to transfer in year. So if you're thinking about moving to get your child into a grammar school, and you're doing that after the usual entry point, so usually you'll register for 11 plus exams whilst the child's in year 5, they sit the exam right at the beginning of year 6, you get your school places offered at the beginning of March, while they're in year 6, and then they attend in the September. If you're doing this, if you're moving after that point, then you're going to be looking at an in-year transfer, which is more complicated because even if you moved into a house right next door to the grammar school, if that school is full, then they can't offer you a place. You then have to go and knock on the doors of the schools in the area or ask the local authority to place you, and you might end up in a school that is much further away. You can go on a waiting list and wait for a spot to come up and then take a test, but they don't often come up. So it's another important thing to consider. And I've just put the resources on the screen again. I'm going to pass back over to Willow, who's going to quickly talk through some independent schools information.
Yes, so a lot of what Kerry has talked about there for grammar schools also applies for independent schools, but there's a few slightly different complications. So I'm going to quickly zoom through those. Just do bear in mind we've got a Q&A session at the end, so I'll only be a couple of minutes on this and then we'll talk through your questions. We have had a Q&A question come in specifically about the topic I'm about to talk about, so I'll see if I can cover it in this, but if I don't, we'll also discuss it in the Q&A after this as well. So we looked at some numbers for grammar schools before, and just to be aware, there are a lot more independent schools. We've got 1,500 independent senior schools. They're not all selective. Some of them, if you just live near them and you're happy to pay the fees, you can get in. Some of them accept from age 11. Traditionally, they would have accepted from age 13 and use a 13 plus process. But because most state schools, almost all state schools, are 11, age 11 entry, independent schools have gone the same way. So there'll be a mix of 11 plus and 13 plus entry. Some schools that have 13 plus entry, they will also have 11 plus pre-test. And what this lets you do is you're sort of showing your potential at age 11-ish, and you're taking a pre-test that should be difficult for your grade, but isn't at an age 13 level. Then later on, you'll take an additional test usually. Many schools will also separately have a 13 plus entry exam open to everybody. It's just a way to sort of move up the shortlist a bit and show them your potential earlier on. It's hugely variable. So some schools have 11 and 13. Some schools even that have entry at 11, they will also obviously allow you to enter at 13. So there'll be many, many different tests called 13 plus entry, and it's hugely variable what they're doing at independent schools. They can use different papers, they can use different boards, they can use their own things. So when we say 11 plus and 13 plus, we can mean lots of different things. So it's really worthwhile speaking to somebody who knows about it, making sure you're doing your research, and just understanding whether something is a pre-test. Even at 11 plus entry, you might have a selection test and the main test. So there's lots of extra steps to independent school entry, as well as interviews. So that's probably the main difference between grammar school and independence. A big part of it is about the interview. They're looking for, do you fit into this school? It might be a school that's very theatrically focused, very musical, very drama focused, or it might be a school that's really academic and they only want students who are very focused on that. As I said, they might have different sorts of tests. They often use tests called the CAT4 for independent schools that really test more strongly the reasoning skills, and they'll often have an English and creative writing paper. They're really wanting to see their potential to be growing faster and faster and better and better at this age, whereas 11 plus, they're more trying to test your capacity at the age, whereas testing more things, independent schools get a better read of where you might be in future. There's a big challenge as well with applications for independent schools is you're not just dealing with the variation in application dates, application requirements, exam formats. It also has to fit in with your life. So it's not just that you're living in Trafford, going to a school in Trafford. You could send your child to a boarding school far away if you wanted to. You could have a longer commute. Often independent schools will have school buses that allow you to have longer commutes. So you're having to pick amongst cost, atmosphere, whether it fits your family. So it really is a much more complicated choice at this level. And it also affects the complication in terms of the exams. They're very, very difficult. The more prestigious the school, the harder it can be. And there's sort of no limit on this because they know that people will keep studying and getting tuition to get better and better. There's a big emphasis on creativity and originality. They will have literature tests, creative writing tests. They might even, at some schools, have things like a science test to see your level at that as well. So they can be much more varied in what they're offering in terms of testing. Because there's more in the papers, the time management is even harder. Because they're stretched out over selection tests, pre-tests, 11 to 13 plus, many schools doing different papers. A lot of emotional pressure for independent school applications. So they're a lot harder to handle. Many students do both grammar and independent. That's really a lot of juggling of emotions, and they're very competitive. So we just want to look at a few things quickly you can do to prepare for exams. Work on cognitive skills development, so making sure they're playing games and puzzles from a young age. Definitely practicing writing skills from a young age. So things like persuasive writing, creative writing, doing that from year 3, 4, 5, and making sure it's something they're passionate about, that they're happy to do, that isn't going to feel like a chore in the exam. Doing lots of mock exams and making very clear that they're aware of what exactly is covered in each type of exam. So you're doing school X practice today, it's got these papers, you've got this amount of time. You're doing school Y, it's got a piece of writing, it's also got a science test today, practicing those. Last one we're going to look at is also interview preparation. Schools don't want students to be overly prepared, but that doesn't mean that you should just be sending them in there to chat. Students often find it overwhelming to do interviews at this age. All we want them to do is show their best selves. So talk about their hobbies, talk about their things they're excited in, but also make sure they're aware of the particular school they're applying to and why they care about that one. And just make sure you're giving a lot of emotional support at this type of application. It is really difficult. As adults, we're used to things like complicated job applications, long drawn out mortgage applications, but this is often a child's first experience with something like this, and independent school applications are a lot more complicated in this front than grammar school applications. The positive note that I'm going to end on, though, is as Kerry said, grammar schools are harder to get into later. 11 plus is really your only entry point. Independent schools, I've heard of people calling a school on a Monday and having a place by the Wednesday. You can get in if you've got a place, if you've got the money, straight away. They are much more flexible because they want students to be coming if you're a strong student. So it's a lot more flexible on that front. If you're moving countries, moving areas in the middle of a year, this is your best option. You can always look at applying to grammar schools later on. And in fact, I successfully applied to a grammar school for A-level entry, so at 16. You can change later on, it's just not as flexible as independent schools. We've got our contact details here. Kerry and I are just going to quickly go into the Q&A. We've got a couple of quick questions. I think hopefully I've covered the 13 plus 11 plus question here. And I'm just going to, if you've got any other questions, drop them in the chat. If we don't get a chance to get around to them all today, we will be sending out emails to everybody, and Lola will be sending out in the chat information about how to get in touch with us later and how to join our mailing list. So we've got a question we're going to start with. I'm going to ask just a quick question to Kerry. One I think is maybe quite helpful is about, we've talked a lot today about long-term preparation, but not everyone's in that position. So there might be people going to independent school exams very soon, or even quite soon. They're applying to grammar schools and having to have exams in September. What can you be doing if you haven't got over a year to prepare?
Okay, so if you're looking at exams imminently for independent schools, then you need to focus your practice on as many past papers as you can. And if you're starting from scratch, then I would start by going through those papers, your child going through those papers with someone who understands them. So whether you're able to do that as their parent, or whether you engage a tutor to help them with that, to talk them through how they answer each question, how they're going to be marked, so that they can understand it. And then also equipping them with skills for how to navigate when they don't know what to do, because that is going to be, if they've not had the preparation, that's going to be something they're going to find a lot, that they don't know what to do. So that's the most important thing for imminent exams. If you're only just sort of starting to think about preparation now for 11 plus in September, then I would be looking at getting your child reading regularly. I would be looking at finding practice materials that you can start to build in as regular weekly practice, whether that's 10-minute tests or vocab books or mental arithmetic books. And then also thinking about tuition, if that is right for your child. So whether that's weekly tuition or intensive sort of week-long like holiday camps to give them that grounding and familiarization. We are running some of those in the new year. So if that does sound of interest, let us know.
And we have in fact also got, let us just put a link in the chat about a familiarization test. So you can get a sense of your child's level right now with a quick test to see their level. I think we're at the end of time now, so if anybody needs to leave, do feel free to do that, and we'll be putting some clips of anything that is very useful on the website. Lola has just put in the link to our resource hub as well in the chat. We've got lots of articles, lots of parent guides in there. On our website, you can also join our newsletter. If anyone's got time to stay around, let's just do one last question, just to make sure we can cover any that we can. So, Kerry, do you want to pick one last question for us?
Yeah, we had a question specifically sort of about 11 plus and 13 plus exams. And I think it was sort of which offers more options for secondary school selection. So I think in terms of, is it better to prepare for 11 plus entry, or is it better to wait a bit and go for 13 plus entry? Is it really a numbers game? What's it about?
Yeah, I think as I talked about previously, it's going to really vary depending on the school. So, and I will say it depends on your child. Some students just really mature later. I have met some students who have been preparing for 11 plus, and they weren't able to really show their best selves on the paper because they just didn't have that sort of emotional maturity to prepare enough, or their vocabulary wasn't quite solid in their mind. So you could see they have potential, but they just weren't able to do very well in the exams. And when they went and tried again for 13 plus, they were absolutely there on the page. So I think have a start at preparing for 11 plus. If you think your expectation isn't matching up to where your kid's able to achieve, it might be worth taking that pressure off and just focus on 13 plus. But you do often find students who are really, ahead of their peer group at that age. So it's worth going in at 11 plus and being able to jump straight in. There isn't really an option in terms of giving you more options for secondary school. It really varies depending on the schools. And I would say it's best just to work around what's going to give your child the best experience of applying. Would you add anything else to that?
I think, yeah, you've covered it well. The only other sort of considerations are if you're going for 13 plus entry, they still need to attend school for year 7 and year 8. And so that could potentially then mean more transitions for your child, and different children cope in different ways with those kinds of transitions. So it's not just a decision of where are they more likely to get in at 11 or at 13, but also, okay, well, if they're going for 13 plus entry, are they equipped to be able to deal with that transition? Because they've moved from primary into secondary, they've left one group of friends and made another one, and now they're going to do that again. Now, if the school that they're aiming for, everyone is joining at 13, at least everyone will be in the same boat, and that will ease that transition. But it is something to consider if your child finds transitions difficult or finds making friends difficult. So there's also that element as well, which is why when we talked about independent schools, it's more of a lifestyle choice and what fits in well with your life and your child.
I mean, I think the good thing about it is it offers you the chance to say, I really want to go to a grammar school and I'm going to focus on that 11 plus entry. If my kid doesn't get into that, we'll see how they settle into a secondary school. We've already got the backup of 13 plus entry to independent school if we need it in the future. So I think it just gives you more options. If you're not sure at the 11 plus stage, you know that you've got other options for independent schools later on. So I think that is all the time we've got today. Thank you to Lola, our colleague, who has just shared lots of great resources in the chat. So just to go through those, we've got a familiarization test where you can check your kids' level on a free online test. It sends you the results and a test straight away. You've got a link to our resource hub, which has got lots of parent guides, great introductions that should cover everything we've talked about today. Hopefully some articles are very related to what we've discussed as well. And we've also got links to, there's a few slots left for this Saturday and next Saturday. We have got free taster workshops for our 11 plus courses. They're aimed at younger students, so students in grades 4 and 5, but could go at grade 3 as well, or year 4 and 5 and year 3. And they're kind of fun themed versions of 11 plus exams, so they won't feel scary. One's about adventuring the undergrowth, and one is about the pirate adventure. So this Saturday, Adventure in the Undergrowth's got a couple of slots left, so book your space on that. And we've also got our newsletter that you can join to get lots of free reading lists and resources that we send out all the time. So do sign up to those. We will leave the room open for a minute or two just to let you click on any links that you want to. But that is the end of our session today. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Kerry, for sharing your wisdom as well. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.